Think we're ready. So I'm just gonna start. I have no idea how long this is gonna take. So I've got like over 100 slides. So I don't know if we're just gonna. I don't know if we're gonna get through it. So I may end up just kind of abruptly being like, and it's an hour, so we'll finish next week. So, um, yeah. So I'm just gonna jump in. Okay, cool. So hello everybody. Hope you're all doing great. Thank you for coming. Uh, um, so yeah, this is week 17, which is insane. But yeah, week 17 of biblical interpretations. As is tradition, my name is James. I'm a husband, a father, and I own an automotive business. I have a degree in biblical and theological studies in ancient Near Eastern history, although I'm not an expert in anything. We started this class back in October to discuss a specific epistemological and hermeneutic framework I have developed over the course of my life. We spent the first 8 weeks building a foundational paradigm so that I could say the following sentence and hope that it makes sense. The revelation of God is inherently contradictory. The biblical text describes a God defined beyond all knowledge that also wants to be known. The moment the knowledge of God transcends the boundary between what is not known to what is known, that God no longer is transcendent, but rather continuous and becomes defined by what is known. And so, this is the fundamental concern of the biblical text. How can humanity know God without God being entirely defined by all that is known? This is the fundamental issue we are seeking an answer to. Another way to think of it is, how can God be known as this without becoming known as something like this? And so last week we finally finished the book of Genesis. We read and mapped nearly the entire book, only skipping a few chapters. 5 generations we traced, from Terah all the way to the 12 sons of Israel. So Genesis is a story about place, from Ur to Haran to Canaan to Egypt. We see this theme where God says to each generation, go and know I will bring you back here. Isaac is the only person born in, lived in, and died in the land without ever leaving. And so we see repetition of places like Shechem, Bethel, Hebron, Beersheba, and the Negev. We see repetition of actions, abuses in power, fear dictating decisions, the diminishing of hospitality. We see repetitions of city gates, of feet washing. We see generations strife over wells and cisterns. We see acquaintances met and marriages sprung to life by the hospitality shown at the sources of water. And so we finished last week with everyone in Egypt. Now, from here, we have a lot of different directions we could go with this class. I'm not going to lie, I'm struggling to determine what to prioritize next. Emotionally, I want to just keep the story going. Just start in Exodus 1 and keep going as we've been. Keep reading the text and keep mapping events as they come up. Do you know why? Because to me, this is the best way to read the text. In large chunks, as much as you can in one sitting, not random paragraphs or verses here or there. We don't take a 3-hour movie and watch it in 10-minute segments spread over 18 weeks. And we certainly don't watch a 3-hour movie in 10-minute segments in some random order spread over 18 weeks. Why? Because it would be so much harder to grasp the story if we spread it out like that. So I struggle with taking segments of the biblical text in order to study whatever can be studied when I feel meaning is clear when reading as much as possible together. So maybe let's just do that. Let's just start from Exodus 1 and let's start reading straight through. I'll stop and comment on stuff as I think of it because that's what I do. And we'll map everything as it comes up. And we will not leave this room until we are done. So I locked the door. Nobody's leaving. It took us roughly 8 weeks to get through Genesis. We got like 67 more books to do. So, um, yeah, we're going to be in here for like the rest of our lives. No, you don't want to do that? Oh, okay. So you'd like to leave at some point. You want a bathroom break? You want to eat some food? You might want to think about other things, God forbid. You want a different form of entertainment? You want to see friends, see family, socialize in the world? So this brings us to a very important conversation. It's probably the starting point of everything we can discuss from here. And that is this: how much of the text needs to be read in one sitting in order to derive meaning? On one end of the spectrum, maybe you need to read every word in one sitting in order to find the most meaning. Or maybe you can read one single word and find meaning from just a word. So today I'll read in, and tomorrow we'll come back and I'll read a, and the next day I'll read beginning. Or maybe you believe you can read some words per sitting and derive meaning, like in a beginning. Or maybe you think you can read a single verse and derive meaning. Or maybe meaning can only come from multiple verses read together. Or paragraphs. Or reading chapters. Or entire books. Or multiple books. Or some other unknown or undefined amount. Regardless where you draw the line, I do know if you never read it, you can't derive any meaning at all. Or on the other end of the spectrum, I'm not entirely sure what this would mean, but maybe you're claiming you have to read all the words in one sitting, and even then there aren't enough words to derive meaning. So why did I make this spectrum paradigm? Because I hope you can see the semantic issues. Let's say I made the claim and drew a hard line in the sand and I said, you have to read the entire Bible in one sitting in order to derive any meaning from it. Any option below this red line cannot conclude realistic meaning. The obvious question to ask in response to that claim would be, well, what is the Bible? Or maybe you'd say, that is impossible to do. Nobody can physically sit in a room and read the entire Bible straight through without ever stopping. So maybe we loosen the claim a bit. We move the line in the sand, we lower the red line. So now I'm saying any approach above the red line allows for meaning to be derived. As long as you read the entire Bible or an entire book, then you can conclude meaning. Anything below the red line cannot conclude meaning. The obvious question to ask in response to this claim would be, well, what are the books of the Bible that need to be read in one sitting in order to derive any meaning? And also, if you acknowledge there are multiple books within the Bible, then couldn't I just read one book to derive meaning? And in making that claim, you'd be moving the red line down a notch. So now, for example, this claim is saying you have to read the book of Genesis start to finish in one sitting in order to derive meaning from it. Maybe this is a reasonable claim, but you could ask, who said the book of Genesis should be included into the Bible? So let's keep going. Maybe you could say, you must read an entire chapter start to finish in one sitting in order to derive meaning from it. And now this is a claim that some people actually make. It's reasonable to do, so maybe it's true. The question you should ask in response to this, though, is who determined the chapters? Now we are getting to the point of this thought exercise. In thinking about this spectrum paradigm, we've actually created two issues that are the reason I brought any of this up. One, As you go up and down the chart in general, the claim becomes more unreasonable as the physical restraint to meet the claim becomes harder. So we actually create a spectrum measuring the physiological capacity to do the act of reading. So like this. In other words, on the one hand, it is physiological, very easy to not read the text or to read one word from it. On the other hand, it is physiological, extremely difficult to read the biblical text, start to finish, straight through in one sitting, without eating, without breathing. So difficult, in fact, I doubt it has never been done. The other dilemma this highlights is this: who decided or decides what words go into the Bible? Who decided or decides where the verses are? Most Christians have heard of John 3:16, but have you asked yourself, what does that even mean? What does John mean? What does 3 mean? What does 16 mean? Who created those categorizations? And when were they created? Why is John 3:17 not part of John 3:16? Why isn't John 3:18 part of John 3:16 now combined with John 3:17 like this? Why is John 3:16 John 3:16 and not John 3:17 or John 1:18? Who drew the lines? And when were they drawn? What about paragraphs? Did you know that paragraphs are different in English than they are in Greek and how they are in Hebrew? What even is a paragraph? How about chapters? What is John 3 or Genesis 1? What does any of that even mean? Or what about the books? Most Christians have this idea of the New Testament. What is that? If there is a New Testament, then you're implying there's an Old Testament, right? So the Bible is actually one book made up of two other books. So maybe if I claim you have to read an entire book in one sitting to derive meaning from it, what I actually mean is you have to read the entire New Testament in one sitting in order to derive meaning, or you can read the Old Testament in one sitting in order to derive meaning. And God forbid, don't bother combining the two because one has nothing to do with the other. Don't ever read the Old Testament straight through to the New Testament because they are separate and different books. Who decided where the divide is? Did you know Catholics have a third book called the Apocrypha? A whole nother set of books that make up their whole Bible. So if I'm going to make this claim, then I also have to qualify and define what I mean by verse, chapter, book, etc. Because those definitions have changed over time. Heck, let's go a step farther. We have done this entire class without actually picking up a physical Bible. Here's a screenshot of the Bible I have been using for this entire class. It's completely digital. Here is a picture of one of my physical Bibles. This Bible is divided into two subbooks, often called the Old Testament and the New Testament. Those two books are then subdivided into more books, 66 books in total. The Catholic Bible will be the same, but will have 73 subbooks in total, as there are a few books part of the Catholic canon, not part of the Protestant canon. You should ask yourself, why the difference? Why are they different? And the answer is difference in belief. Or here's an interesting Bible that is actually on the back shelf over there. This Bible doesn't use the term New Testament to call the New Testament the New Testament. Rather, it will use the word Brit Hadashah to mean New Covenant. It also doesn't call the Old Testament the Old Testament, and it doesn't call the Old Covenant the Old Covenant either. Rather, it uses the word Tanakh for what a lot of people understand to mean Old Testament. Do you know why? Because the New Testament is only new if you believe something is old. But if you don't believe something is old, then that just means it just is. And in Judaism, what Christians call the old just is for Judaism. And it's called the Tanakh. So the compiler of this specific Bible is trying to convey something about his belief just in the way in which he compiled this text and just with the words he used to define it. So it's a difference of a person's belief. In some categories of Judaism, there is the Tanakh. The Hebrew word Tanakh is an acronym. Why? Because the Tanakh is actually a book made up of 3 categories of books. T stands for Torah, which is the first 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. N stands for Nevi'im, which means prophets. These are generally divided into 3 more categories. The early prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. However, Samuel and Kings are the same book in the Tanakh. Then the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And then there's the 12 minor prophets, which are considered to be one book: Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. K stands for Ketuvim, which means writings. The writings are also subdivided into different categories. These are books like Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Esther. But here is the deal. This isn't how these books used to look. Right now, we are in the digital age. But prior to the digital age, we had the print age. In 1433, Gutenberg invented the printing press, which dawned a new age of human communication through copying mass-produced text. Gutenberg is what allowed for the Reformation to take place, and until the advent of the internet and the phone, the iPhone, was probably the single greatest invention to push humanity to new levels of epistemology. On the right is a picture of a Gutenberg Bible. Gutenberg invented the printing press, and his first prints were the Latin Vulgate, and these became known as the Gutenberg Bible. Today, they are the most valuable books in the world. The printing press is really what allowed books to become known for how we think of them today. But before the print age, we had the literacy age, or the age of paper. Before the printing press, books were called codex. They were made and printed painstakingly by hand. The Gutenberg. Mm-hmm. So I'll say this again. Before the printing press, they were made by hand. This is a picture of the Codex Vaticanus from the 300s AD, one of the oldest Christian manuscripts containing the Septuagint and the New Testament. We also have the Codex Sinaiticus, also from the 380s, also containing the Septuagint and parts of the New Testament. Hand, every process it took for that to exist is done by hand.
But the printing would be the part where you put ink on the paper. But this,
correct.
So the part that the printing press changed was just the last part.
Correct. Yep. So the actual handwriting.
$35 million.
Exactly.
I had to look.
Yeah, I thought about bringing it up, but I think the last one sold in the 1970s. There's only like 40 of them, and it's been 50 years since any of them have even gone up for auction.
4.5 million in 1987.
Yeah. Okay. So 87. Yeah. So now, prior to the Codex, the medium used, so prior to the codex, the medium used to be different. So does anyone know how manuscripts were made before the codex? Scrolls. And they were handmade. Before
Printing? Or before handmade Bibles or handmade books?
correct.
But these are.
So correct. They're both handmade, but the difference between a scroll, you know what a scroll is? This is called a codex. The shape,
The binding of
a text that is like this, that opens like this, is called a codex.
Yeah,
Like the
that's it.
style of it.
Correct.
That's it. You know, even people, well, I've been around
Robert's a
few
printer
years,
by trade, he's a
and
printer.
I'm a printer, and yet I don't even know what codex is, so thank you.
Yeah, yeah. So those are all codexes, or I forget the plural.
Like
the type of paper?
Yeah,
They're like
like-
animal skins.
Oh.
Yeah, and
Like
that's
the scroll?
yeah, yeah.
They say
And
Getting
like
there.
Paper was made from hemp.
Yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
So prior to the codex, and as I said, the medium. What I mean by that is the format, the style. So prior to the codex, we have scrolls. So scrolls were handmade, hand sewn, usually animal skins of some kind or papyrus. So this is a picture. This is a picture of a handmade Torah scroll that's approximately 150 years old, for sale right now on eBay for $23,000. So remember when I discussed the Tanakh a little bit ago. So today you can buy a Tanakh that will fit in the palm of your hand. But do you know what the Tanakh looked like in scroll form? Like this. So good luck carrying those around. See, each book of the Bible at one point used to be their own individual books. Except for the Torah, these were all individual separate books. Separate individual books. And over time, people combined them together. And the process of combining them together was based on what was believed. The books included and the books left out were based on what people believed. If you go to a synagogue, you'll see a chest called an ark. And in the ark will be handmade Torah scrolls. The biblical text used to be copied by hand in scroll form, not mass produced in China. In 1946, one of the most important archaeological finds ever was found in the northwest corner of the Dead Sea. On our maps, you see Qumran. This archaeological find was what is now known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls include numerous different scrolls, some of which are the oldest manuscripts of some biblical texts. A lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls were scrolls that were handmade and hand copied from around 300 to 100 BC. The scrolls were placed in jars and hidden in a cave. These clay jars, yes. These texts are some of the greatest archaeological finds ever, such as the Great Isaiah Scroll, which is the oldest complete copy of the book of Isaiah ever found, dating to somewhere between 300 BCE to 100 BCE. That doesn't look like anything like your Bible, does it?
This was
Mm-hmm.
This is the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Dead Sea Scrolls. So there's hundreds of them.
And it's the book of Isaiah.
This is the book of Isaiah. This is one scroll.
Is that what has been essentially translated into what's in our book of Isaiah today?
A huge part of it, yes.
I just speak as 60 seconds here.
Mhm.
Downtown St. Paul, there's a science museum. I don't know if any of you know about the science museum.
Yeah.
Do you know that they had the Dead Sea Scrolls there at one time? Yes, many years ago. How many years ago? Pardon?
Like an exhibit?
Yeah, it was like 10 years ago.
Yes. Call the science museum. Someone will know. They'll have some of that trip that they made through St. Paul, Minnesota.
Oh.
That's good.
Yeah, we were very fortunate here.
Yeah. That was like the only time that many of them have ever been outside of Palestine. So
Is that where they are?
yes. So today they're in
So
Jerusalem.
they were there and brought here.
Yeah, it was a big deal. Yeah, it was like 10 years ago.
Military plane.
Yeah, it was a big deal. Yeah.
COVID there,
Can't imagine the security that they would have around.
because there were people that were dealing with these scrolls in more than one area, that there may yet be additional caves to be found.
There's more scrolls. Huh?
Absolutely.
You do.
They actually still in the caves where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found back in the 40s. They still find scrolls. You know, they're not scrolls. They find like little pieces. You know, and as technology gets better, they're able to combine. You know, which actually just last month, a huge technological breakthrough happened where they not biblical texts, but texts from Greece, I believe. They're able to take a scroll and read it without unrolling it by doing like certain types of X-ray laser scanning. Is fascinating. That just happened last month. That's a big deal. Yeah, no, literally, if you touch it, it disintegrates. I don't even know. I couldn't tell you. Yeah. Okay, so Great Isaiah Scroll, which again, this doesn't look like anything, not like your Bible at all. And so we're going to zoom in on one section of this. And so this is ancient Hebrew. So anyone here able to read this? So notice a few things about this text. One, there is no obvious heading or title. 2, there are no obvious chapters. 3, there are no obvious verses. 4, the Hebrew doesn't have vowels or markings. 5, some of you may not know this, but Hebrew is read right to left. So you have to read it backwards from what you're used to in English. And so this is Isaiah chapter 1, verse 1. And it says, the vision of Isaiah, son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Hebrew is very dense.
Like these are all okay. So originally, from my understanding, is all these books were individual scrolls.
Mhm.
Were all these scrolls in one place?
The Dead Sea Scrolls?
No.
Oh,
talking
no.
like,
No.
right. That's
Yeah,
what
the Bible in general. This is what we're getting towards. And so the age of paper is divided into codex and scroll. So what came before paper? Well, so, and to Rachel's question, Rachel asked, when was papyrus? What about papyrus? And papyrus is Egyptian paper. And so the Egyptians invented paper, and they invented it around 3000 BC. And so we have had writing on paper for 5,000 years. Yes, but the Egyptian papyrus is older, is my understanding. So don't fight me on that. But okay, so what became before paper? And so we get engravings, stone, copper, rocks. I like rocks.
There are some tribes that kept their history not on paper, not on caves, but through memorization.
Yes. I'm going to just stop you there, okay?
We'll get there.
So, for example, this is a picture of the Ketef Hinnom scrolls. These were discovered in Jerusalem by my old professor, archaeologist Dr. Gabriel Barkai, who I was fortunate enough to get to take archaeology of Jerusalem with in Jerusalem. He found these, yes. So these are made out of copper, and these are dated to 600 BCE.
That's a scroll.
Is a scroll. It's about this big.
Made out of copper.
Made out of copper.
Thin and
It's very
like
thin.
all crumpled up.
Correct. Yep. Because they unrolled it.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to
Just
interrupt.
in the dirt.
This is like fascinating.
In the dirt in today what we would call hell.
Wow.
Different conversation.
Hair up that? Like a crazy value?
Say what?
A whole different technology.
Yeah. And so can you see the text carved into the copper?
No.
Right, exactly. So here we can see the text on one of the scrolls outlined. I mean, so here's what it says. So line 1 is the tetragrammaton, or the word I've used in the class, Hashem. And then 2, it says, I'm just going to read this basically. It says, the great who keeps the covenant in graciousness towards those who love him and those who keep his commandments. The eternal, blessing more than any, snare and more than evil, for redemption is in him. For Hashem is our restorer and rock. May Hashem you and keep you. Hashem make shine. These lines seem to be pulling from Exodus 20, verse 6, Deuteronomy 5:10, Deuteronomy 7:9, Daniel 9:4, Nehemiah 1:5, and especially the last lines that say, Hashem bless you and keep you, and Hashem's face shine upon you. That is known as the priestly blessing from Numbers chapter 6. And so these copper scrolls are the oldest manuscript of any biblical text ever found, dating to 600 BC. So what's earlier than that? What's earlier than the copper scrolls? Stone. This is called the Mesha stela, and is one of the most important archaeological finds of all time. This was found in 1868. Today it is at the Louvre in Paris, making it one of the pillars of ancient Near Eastern archaeology that I have yet to see myself, but someday I will go see it. The stela is dated to 840 BCE. It is the longest inscription found from the Iron Age. This is the Moabite depiction of a story that is written about in 2 Kings chapter 3. So yes, you heard that correctly. There is an archaeological object from the opposing side of a story that is written about in the biblical text. This was found in Moab, in a town called Dibon, and is written in Moabite language. So if we zoom into this spot here, this is the Tetragrammaton. Also what I've been pronouncing as Hashem. This is the name of God. This is accepted academically to be the oldest inscription of the name of God ever to be found. On the opposite side of the same line, reading right to left, we see this. This says Israel, and is one of the oldest inscriptions and evidences of the existence of a people group called Israel. And so in the Stone Age, we see stones with inscriptions on it. But what became before stone? How did people communicate before inscriptions on stones? Well, stone. Stone is the end of the line. There is nothing in the archaeological record to be found earlier than what can be found that isn't stone of some kind. And so here we go again. Let's chart what we now know. At the top, we have the present time. As discussed all the way back in sessions 2 and 3 in October, the present is always expanding, always growing. At the other end, we have the beginning of human existence, an unknown amount of time ago. And we have the invention of the internet and the smartphone, the digital age. This is what the age we've been in. You know what the next step in the digital age is? We're just at the beginning of whatever's coming next. Virtual reality, artificial intelligence, simulated realities. Ooh. Going back, we have the printing press in Gutenberg. We have the codex, like Sinaiticus. I'm sure I'm butchering that word, but so be it. We have scrolls like the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have engravings, carvings, metallurgy, like the Copper Scrolls. And we have stone, like the Mesha Stela. So what came before? Before anyone carved anything into stone, or inscribed words to a scroll, or put pen to paper, what was before? Words, speech, or what is most importantly to be called oral tradition. It's information spoken. It's information repeated. Stories told generation after generation. It's the intangibles. Now look at this chart. What are we looking at here? What does this tell us? What is this a spectrum of? It's a paradigm regarding the practicality and accessibility to communication. Now, I want you to think about this. With each step in a change of communicative medium, does the prior methodology cease to exist? What I mean is, when we started using smartphones, did books go away or disappear? Did people stop writing books? No. When the printing press was invented, did people stop writing by hand? No. When people started writing on paper by hand, did people stop engraving into metal and stone? No. When people started engraving metal and stone, did oral communication stop? No. When people started engraving into metal and stone, did oral tradition stop? No. When people started writing on paper, did oral tradition stop? No. When people started printing books, did oral tradition stop? No. When people started using the internet and cell phones, did oral tradition stop? No. When people start using VR and AI, will oral tradition stop? No. Any given step forwards in the medium does not eliminate or negate the existence or the continued use of the ones prior. And the one common median that has existed for all time and will exist for all time, even if all others cease, is oral tradition. As long as there are humans, there will be oral tradition. Do you know how insanely difficult and time-consuming it is to carve something in stone? Actually imagine the process of creating this. It would be difficult to do by hand today. While you are spending your time carving this, you are not finding water, you are not finding food. It takes people and resources concentrated into the energy required to make something like this. Do you think the totality of what is written in stone is equal to what was being thought about or what was communicated orally? Are the amount of words equal to the amount of thought? No. From this perspective, you can see what technology is. Each breakthrough in technology bridges the gap between the total amount of oral tradition thought and the total amount of written tradition that can be written. Eventually, if Elon Musk has his way, the next steps in technological advancement might eliminate the need for oral tradition as thoughts get communicated directly to other people. It's as if the goal of technology is to bridge the gap between the tangible physical realm of paper and stone and connect it to the intangible mental realm within our heads. Here is a screenshot of the Neuralink website. This is a company that is very close to the point of being able to implant a computer interface into your brain and allow you to control a computer with your thoughts. If two people have this device, they will be able to transmit thoughts over the internet without verbal or written communication. Neuralink, yeah. This is fascinating. But this is the opposite end of the spectrum than what I want to talk about or what immediately concerns us. But I will say this, even with this, oral tradition will not stop. So let's back up. Imagine you dig in the ground. You find a stone with writing on it. Maybe a single word. Maybe it's the Tetragrammaton. You keep digging. You keep digging, and you're digging and digging and digging. And somebody approaches you and they say, "What are you looking for?" And you respond with, "I'm trying to find the oral tradition of this object." Do you see the problem? Understand the physical, tangible object is a physical manifestation of the intangible thoughts and oral communications of the person or persons that created the physical object. It is not the other way around. Until this exists, and even then, no tangible object can be comprehensively representative of the intangible thoughts and oral traditions surrounding why any given physical thing exists. You are never going to dig in the ground and find intangible oral tradition. I keep showing this picture of the Mesha stela. How do you know what this is? You know what it is because I told you what it is. How do I know what it is? Because I read in a book, or I've talked to an archaeologist who have told me what it is. How do the authors of that book or those archaeologists know what it is? Because somebody told them what it is. How do they know what it is? Because somebody told them what it is. How do they know what it is? Because somebody told them what it is. How do they know what it is? Because the archaeologist who found it published an academic paper stating what it is. Oh, okay, cool. So what is it? Well, it's a stele. So actually, I've been pronouncing it wrong the entire time because I've said stele, and it's actually pronounced stele. I did that on purpose because I wanted to confuse you. So now you ask, well, what the heck is a stele? Well, the archaeologist who found it said it's a stele because the archaeologist he learned from told him that's what it is. And that guy knows what steles are because somebody he studied under told him what steles are. And that guy knows what steles are because the guy he studied under told him what steles are. And that guy knows what steles are because they find objects like this all over the archaeological record. So they use this word, stele, to describe things that look like this. The etymology of this word is from the Greek and it means standing block. It's funny, when I was writing about this, thinking about there's a meme out there that's basically like the entirety of Egyptology is just a giant pyramid scheme. Which is hilarious when you think about it. So, but why? Why is it called stele? It's Greek, it means standing block. But why call it that? Because that's what it is. But all because it's a standing block, does that mean that's what its use was? Or its purpose? Do you think the person who carved this did so just for the purpose of it being a standing block? That makes me think of one of my favorite pointless signs in existence. Caution, this sign has sharp edges. Do not touch the edges of this sign. What's the point of this? Right? And so the purpose for the existence of the Mesha stele is likely because somebody wanted to communicate something. And we can use science and logic to gauge what those purposes may have been, certainly. But there is a limit to what we can know. Something like the Mesha stele has all the same hermeneutic issues that any other text may have. You can assume what was written in stone is the most important and intentional part of what was intended to be communicated. But it is not the entirety of all that could have been communicated if the medium of communication was different. Standing stones are representative of memories. We do the same things today. We do the same things where a tangible physical object is the manifestation of something that is an entirely intangible cognitive function. So here's a picture of the headstones of my grandpas. One on my mom's side, the other are 4 generations of my grandpa Kaufman. Nobody can utilize any sort of scientific methodology and know the intangible function these headstones represent for me in my brain. You don't get to tell me my oral tradition and lived experience of my grandpa's. These stones and inscriptions are manifestations and representative of something the stones themselves cannot contain. Here's another good example. I'm going to show you all a picture, and you will all immediately know what it means, and you will all immediately have your own entirely unique cognitive function in your brain regarding what it means for you and only you. There is no physical manifestation of any sort of memorializing or pen that could be put to paper that can ever encapsulate the totality of oral tradition that exists for each person's lived experience and memories regarding September 11th, 2001. We see 2 lights, which I love because of how intangible these beams of light are for being a representation of a tangible physical manifestation of the totality of all persons' intangibles, cognitions of 9/11. The intangible oral tradition and cultural heritage of 9/11 is far, far, far greater than any amount of physical manifestation that could ever be produced about it. Why would we expect these to be any different? An object is never greater than the idea it represents. A stele with text on it means somebody was trying to communicate something. It is logical to assume the location in which something like this was standing might have something to do with the intangible traditions the author is attempting to communicate. But there are also standing stones that don't have text on it. For example, here are some ancient standing stones at Tel Gezer. Gezer is on our maps in Canaan. I've been here. We would have gone here if we had gone. These stones do not have text on them. Archaeologists debate what these were for, what they represented. People have thoughts and ideas, but nobody knows for sure. There's no text on them. So if you have a standing stone with no text on it, you don't know whoever constructed it. Let's see. If you have a standing stone with text on it, you do know whoever constructed it wasn't trying to communicate through words. Whoever put this up wasn't trying to convey meaning through words because there's no words. In our journey through Genesis, we have already come across several examples in the text of standing stones. For example, Jacob sets up standing stones, one at Shechem and one at Bethel. Interesting. My theory is the places themselves, the locations themselves, the land itself are tangible, physical manifestations of intangible cognition and oral traditions. Humanity still thinks like this today. You come to a place you've been before, and you remember the last time you were there. Or maybe it's a place where your parents brought you, and you remember when your parents brought you there. Your memories of visiting that place are intangible traditions of both your parents' physical manifestations in your memories and the oral traditions they passed on to you that you are remembering. And some of those memories you hold are things your parents passed on to you that maybe had been passed on to one of them by their parents, passed on by one of their parents, and so on and so forth. These pictures simply will never mean to any of you what they mean to me. They don't even begin to encapsulate what I can think of when I see them. And short of me trying to verbally explain it to you or write it down, no amount of an attempt on your part of engaging with these photos is going to allow you to conclude what is in my head, regardless of time. And so, we can rationalize an object, can convey something of meaning by having text on it. And we can rationalize an object, can convey something of meaning by its location. We can rationalize an object, can convey something of meaning by what it is. And this idea is much harder to do because how do you know what something is? So if you have your map, feel free to look at it, not have it up on the screen. But we find Beersheba and we go west to Gerar, and we go north on the road and we find this city, Lachish. Lachish is one of the most important known archaeological sites in existence in Palestine. But we'll discuss that another time. But I want you to imagine you're an archaeologist in 1978. Your name is David Usishkin. You come to this mound called Lachish. This is what you see. Doesn't look like much. And in your dig, and you start digging. And in your dig, you find a city gate. And you determine that the city gate is dated to the Iron Age. And you draw this map. So here's a diagram of the gate. We see a code down there. It says level 2 and level 3. Level 2 is 700 BCE. And in the corner of the gate, you find unusual pottery in one of the areas of the gate. Here. X marks the spot, right? And in that group of pottery, you find this. This thing. This strange looking object. You date it, and the other pottery with it, you date it to between the 7th and 6th century BCE, during a period of time after Lachish had been completely destroyed. You jot down some notes and move on. 5 years later, you're back. You're digging again in the same area. And you realize all the work you did previously on plot number 4017 was wrong. You learned something that changed what you thought. So you changed the dates of these items from the 7th century to the 8th century. But it's puzzling because that meant this object was sitting in the gate of a significant city during the peak of its function and fortification. Your work gets published academically, the end. And then 40 years later, this kid named me, I'm in school in Jerusalem, and my professor tells me to go to the museum and pick a random artifact to write a report on. And I foolishly pick this object. And this is what I see at the museum. It says, foot bath, Lachish, 8th century, BCE, pottery. So I picked this object to write a paper on, thinking, it's a foot bath. This will be easy. But no. Instead, it turns out to be one of the most difficult assignments I ever had in school. Why? Well, it took me a very long time to find Usishkin's published field report titled Excavations at Tel Lachish, 1978 to 1983, which I could not find in anywhere online No existence of it anywhere. And I happened, finally, after weeks, found a physical copy of it in my school's library. But in his field report, all he says is foot bath. There is zero explanation given as to why this is a foot bath or how it's known to be a foot bath. Zero. So I have to keep digging and keep digging and digging and digging. And I can't find anything online. Nothing. I can't find anything in any academic journal as to how the heck this guy knew this was a foot bath. Nothing. I spent weeks trying to answer this question. It was hell. And eventually, I find a physical copy of this academic journal. If I recall, that was from 1936. And in this journal, I read about a very important archaeologist who went through exactly the issue that I was going through in writing my paper. This archaeologist was named Kathleen Kenyon, which, if you don't know that name, I strongly recommend Googling her. One day in the 1930s, she's digging in Samaria, and she finds an unusual pottery and doesn't know what it is. And this is what she found. She leaves it at that. She found an object and she drew this picture. She found that, right. No, she found an object and she drew a picture of it and left it at that. So I find that, I'm like, okay. So then I'm still trying to look through academic journals and I'm trying to find anything about what she has to say about this. And finally, I come across this. In July 1931, and you can just hear the British snobbery here. I'm joking. In July 1931, two of our party had the opportunity of visiting Sinjil, a village 20 miles from Nablus where the women make large water jars and other ware by hand. A selection was set out under a tree, and among the pots we saw a bowl that struck us at once by its resemblance of our Israelite foot bath. That's from the Palestine Exploration Fund, 1932. And so this is what she saw in 1931 in Sinjil. And so I know that the object on the right is a foot bath because when Usishkin found it, he knew it was a foot bath because he studied with an archaeologist who knew Kathleen Kenyon, who was the first academic archaeologist to find a foot bath like in the center. And it took her a year to learn what it was. And she only knew what it was because she found a similar object still in use. And so it took 100 years for my epistemological understanding of what a Canaanite foot bath looked like to come to fruition. And upon finding that, I got my paper done in a few hours. It took me weeks, and it was one page. And so this is the point. An object is a tangible, physical item. You can use science to learn of the epistemological existence of objects, but no amount of research will tell you its intangible use. The object is tangible. Its use has been passed down generationally for thousands of years. If it had still not been in use, we wouldn't know what it was. But what it is defined by its use. And its use is intangible. The only way Kathleen Kenyon knew what it was because of the oral tradition of its use being passed down generationally for thousands of years. But the object itself does not define what the object is. Its intangible use defines what it is. I can show you a picture of the tangible object, but I cannot show you a picture of its intangible use. The only way I could do that would be to go to Samaria and find a person using one of these today. I cannot show you a picture of its use because it's intangible. So, all of these things are tangible objects. You can use tangible scientific inquiry to find them, to visit them, to see them with your own eyes. But the tangible will not tell you the intangible. And so, the oral tradition spans human history. It existed before there was writing. It exists to this day. And sometimes those intangible oral traditions are actually the only way we can know anything. No amount of scientific inquiry will tell us information that can only be known by the generational continuation of intangible heritage via oral tradition. I want to say we have come face first with the work my wife Rebecca does. She actually deals with these issues professionally every day as a curator of religion in a museum. Because I am dumb and she isn't, it took me a long time to connect the dots between the work that she has been doing to understand how what I've been thinking about my whole life is the intangible of what she does. She has several terms she has used over the years that have profoundly influenced me greatly, including the frameworks of intangible and tangible heritage. I would strongly recommend anyone speak to her regarding her work, as it's where the rubber meets the road as far as what this study is about. So we come to the end for tonight. I mean, you might be asking yourself, what does any of this have to do with the biblical text? And this is where we pick up moving forward. This sets us on the path for the entire purpose of our study. So let's ponder this. Is this tangible or intangible cultural heritage? Or what about these? These are objects. Is the object itself going to tell us what it is? What about this? Thank you everyone for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. I hope this was helpful and insightful. So does anyone have any questions? Did you look it up?
No, we first were guessing that like forever ago.
Really?
You figured it out and you're like, kind of, well, we'll see, you know.
I don't remember, but it's
But
fine.
like, not in the way other ones you would have known. Do you know what I mean? I don't remember how we were talking about it, but
It's one of those. See, I wish on display at the museum they didn't have anything. You know, if it was just sitting there with nothing, you know, because it and that's what I was trying to do, was by like showing people with no explanation at all as to what it is.
yeah.
You know, it's kind of like I wanted that lingering feeling of like that's the whole issue, and it applies to every physical object. Is at the end of the day, you know what something is because of the oral tradition of how you've been taught what it is, which is fascinating to think about. And that framework absolutely applies to the biblical text. This is the most essential component of what makes Judaism Judaism. It's literally built into Judaism.
No. Go back to that.
Standing.
This,
Yeah, what's on there?
so it's a story from the Moabites. Mm-hmm. So they're on the. Let me go back to that section.
And was this?
It's not the 1800s, right? How did someone in that generation know how to read Moabite?
We knew the languages by then.
I take it the person that found it wasn't the person that translated it, right? I think I would imagine there's a lot of people involved.
Yeah.
In, like picking what that is.
Yeah. I don't know specifically this one, and the issue with an item like this, one, it was found a long time ago, like 1800s. Two, there's some hesitation. So one of the issues you run into with archaeology is a field. It evolves over time. Like archaeology, the British kind of invented the formality of it, the idea of it. And when it first was like, we should do this, the methodologies they used in the 1800s by today's standards are like atrocious, just like absolutely horrible. Like they just destroyed stuff because they didn't know how to even properly dig, right? So for example, there's a difference between an archaeological artifact that is found in what's called in situ, so like where you find an object in its place, versus an object that is found not in its place, where it's been moved or something. Right. And so like the very first Dead Sea Scrolls ever found were not found in place.
That's not where they belong.
The very first Dead Sea Scrolls that were found, like when they first became known to scholars, they were brought to somebody for sale.
It wasn't like breaking news. We just found this.
No, it took a while. So I have a book. I'm so happy I got this. Got it a month ago. It's a first edition book written by the guy that bought the Dead Sea Scrolls for Hebrew University, like back in 1947. And I got a first edition book of his book that he published in like 1950. And in that book, he's got a whole thing talking about that issue. Like the first 3 Dead Sea Scrolls were not found in place, so they all thought they were fake. It took took years of research. And the whole time he talks about he's nervous. He's so nervous of like, well, if these are real, where are they? But if they're not real, we don't want to spend millions of dollars buying them. And that's a real issue. 1946, 1947. Yeah. Yeah.
Out there, like carbon dating and
Yeah.
dating, and how they come up with the exact age of a tangible object.
Right. I never got to dive far enough into, I would say, like the science of archaeology to, I would say, fully be able to explain that. Dating is very complicated. I know that much. And yeah, like things like radiocarbon dating, and there's other ways that, but that's, to me, and that's like, I'm more interested in the theory, if that makes sense. So like one of the issues with dating is like, if you find an object that based on other sites, archaeologically speaking, it's like, oh, well, this thing didn't exist prior to this date. And then you find that, then that's going to help you date the layer, for example. And there's all kinds of, it's a huge puzzle piece that all gets put together. And then they're like, this is the most logical explanation you can give for dating. The Dead Sea Scrolls have been, I don't think there's any text that's been studied more, probably. There's so.
I'm assuming like what like the kind of what's actually in like the purpose of the scroll itself. I'm assuming that obviously where it was found, what that item is, doesn't belong where it was found. So is there any context?
It does.
Oh, so they belonged in that cave? It just, that almost seems like.
Yep.
Was that cave a temple or?
Yeah, it's a lot. It's fascinating. So they were hidden to protect them, basically from. That's literally, they were hidden for the purposes of preservation.
Okay.
Like that, the scribes that made them, that's why.
So was that like where they belong, or was that like, that's where they were hidden?
That's where they made them. That's where they hid them. Okay.
It wasn't. So is there any other markings or something like in that place?
There's like a village there that's been found now. Yeah, now that the Dead Sea Scrolls were found,
So it's not just some.
no, and this is the stuff, dude, that when, earlier this year, it's like, hey, like, we're gonna go on this trip. This is a place we'd go. Because, like, you can go there. You can see all of this. It's very cool.
You still have that slide of like that where they were found.
Yeah, I'm trying to find it.
That almost looks like an area that is not really you don't just walk there. You know.
Yeah, here you go. So
In that hole.
yeah, this is the cave that they were found. But there's a whole infrastructure on top of the hill over here.
Okay, so to scale that hole, that's.
It feels like an Indiana Jones.
Massive.
Yeah, I'm gonna say it. It's like Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Like, yeah, crawling.
Yeah, there's.
Can we guess that hole is about 10 feet height?
I can't honestly. It's been so long since I've been there and seen this in person. I can't recall the scale.
Castaway was like hiding.
We'll find a volleyball and.
Yeah. I mean, it's like that. This like from here down to here might be 100 feet, something like that. If I remember, it's a wadi.
It's like where they shot Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yeah, well, this is 100 miles from where they shot Raiders of the Lost Ark. So we actually talked about that. Yeah, that Petra is just south of this. So,
Good job.
To saving these, and that's part of why they went into
Rome. Yeah, is my understanding. And I mean, so the community here is called the Essenes. They're the ones that, and they were like a really specific sect of Second Temple Judaism that went to the desert here in Qumran for the purposes of translating and writing the text. That's what they did. And they were kind of a rebellious faction within Second Temple Judaism. So like, my understanding, it was like, they're like, everything's going to hell, so we need to preserve this, not necessarily like there's a specific threat, but
were the people that did the scrolls connected to the mystics in any way more than others?
I don't know. Yeah.
Was the threat that like Rome will burn our religious
Mhm.
scripts?
That's exactly what happened. Eventually. I mean,
Did that still have been before?
Okay.
Yeah.
The other ones, there would have been maybe other texts that didn't make it.
well, and
That's why
so this is the if I were to, I thought about, we might bring this up next week. I don't know. If we go all the way back to week 2, when I have the epistemological circles and I'm talking about the expansion of knowledge, and then I was like, I've said that it's actually a compression. Okay, the issue with archaeology, again, but this is true of a lot of sciences, but you don't hear these things talked about much, is no amount of archaeological artifacts to be found is ever going to prove or disprove anything. No amount of archaeological artifacts found are ever going to prove or disprove anything. Okay? Because you don't know what you're missing. You don't know what you haven't found.
So if you found the 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments, that doesn't prove.
You're not going to find the 2 tablets.
I know. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Like, that doesn't you wouldn't argue that proves like
That's a good question.
the story.
Good question.
Or like the Ark of the Covenant, for instance.
No.
You don't think it's like hidden under the Vatican?
No, I don't think so. There's no reason to think there's just zero reason to think that. So here's the thing. I treat topics like that in the same way I treat like flat Earth. It's like objectively, yes, I do not know the Earth is flat. Sure. Okay. Like, it's short of me doing what that guy did and getting in a rocket and launching myself into space and seeing it with my own eyes. But again, if that's the threshold we're talking about, of like, I'm not going to believe something unless I see it with my own eyes, right? It's like, I just go, good luck, right? Is the point being, and this is why oral tradition matters. because everybody does stuff every single day that your only cognitive function of your belief as to why you do those things is not scientifically sound, right? That's not how you function as a person. And I don't know why. I mean, I do know why, because heritage matters and we want to attach ourselves to things that give us meaning, right? So the reason that I believe, like the reason why we're looking for that, right, is because we want it for our own purpose in existence, but we're looking in the wrong places because you're not going to find proof of a round or a flat Earth on Earth, right? The most objective proof you'll find is go to space, but you can't do that. You can't do that. So that's not your standard for belief, right? And at some point you just have to go, I'm going to live. And so, for example, I adamantly grew up believing in the young Earth. It's what I was taught.
The what?
The young Earth. The Earth is 6,000 years old. I grew up literally believing Genesis was true, like the point of the story is historical accuracy. I cringe now when I think about it. Like, I have no interest at all in discuss, like, oh, is the Bible historically accurate? Like, that's not the point. And if that's the point you're making it, you're missing the point, right? But for me, it's like, I believed in the young Earth. That's what I grew up believing. I spent so much time trying to I want to argue this, right? And I realized when I was in high school, one of the artifacts I thought about showing is called the Dan stele, or the Cyrus cylinder. I forget which one. There's an artifact that was found, and it's the first and only mention of King David in the archaeological record. Okay, it's a big deal, like really big deal.
Other than that, it's only in the Bible.
Right.
Okay.
So it's like, did King David exist? I think it's the Cyrus scroll, or I cannot remember. I'll probably bring it up in another class. It's a clay cylinder with text in it, kind of like some of this other stuff that I showed pictures of, like this. Except this one's like this big and it's round. And on that it has the name David, like House of David, inscribed. Yeah, something like that. I don't remember. Right. Prior to this being found, the general academic consensus is like King David never existed, not a historical person, right? And then this is found, and now it's like, well, okay, so he probably existed. So it changed the debate. Like, well, what are we, right? So now the academic consensus is like, there was a kingdom of Judah, there was a king named David, there probably was a king named Saul, yada, yada, yada. But then the questions change, the semantics change, right? Oh, cool, there's archaeological evidence for the existence of King David. Well, I'm absolutely going to state my claim on that and believe that. But then they start digging into it, and I'm like, to accept the evidence of the existence of King David, you have to accept the academic scholarship of the fossil record, of geology. It's totally incompatible with everything that I also believed about the Earth being young. And I was like, if I had to pick between the two, and that's kind of the approach I try to take. I deeply value scholarship, and I want to just default to that. It's like, fine, you've got a PhD in this, have at it, right? But oral tradition, okay? And this is what we're going to be talking about. Like the coming classes, we get into Exodus, we get into, and this is, for me, this is to me, my understanding is like when you start to think differently, where you allow for fluidity in interpretation based on what you know to be true as you learn, right? That methodology of thinking is very Jewish. Like, it's built in it's built into Judaism. Christianity is very apprehensive against it. We are very anti-oral tradition, to the point that I've been dealing with this a lot lately and thinking about this class and going through this class of like, you go on TikTok and it's like, just last week I'm like, trying to talk to a person through TikTok, which is a terrible idea. But I'm like, whatever. It's like, this is a fascinating topic, and I'm trying to explain to him, like, it's like, well, we know a piece of pottery because an archaeologist found it. It's like, that's not. We don't know what pottery is because of archaeology. We know what pottery is because of its continued use by humans over time. And that's the thing that people they just mix up, and so you're not looking, in my opinion, you're not looking for the archaeological record for scientific proof of the Bible. And again, well, what's the Bible? It's like, oh, okay, well, this book or this specific text or this specific text. What I'm interested is in what's the totality of all the information, and how do you factor it into interpretation? I do intend to offer you through this class what works for me. I don't need to go into space to believe the earth is round. I've got zero, I don't care. It's interesting. I'm using that as an example. Okay. As I say, those are two different things, right? It's one thing to be like, I have to know this. It's another thing to be like, I don't have any reason to question this, and it's not. There's if I can understand the objective thought process of going, well, unless you see it for yourself, you don't know. It's like, okay, but you know what? That's true of everything.
What is known, what is not known. All the terms from God trying to make himself known to it. Like, it kind of gets back at that, what we know and what we don't know and how we don't know.
It's all epistemology, which is how, and like, I tend to default to that, and it's like, well, it's just epistemology, because that's what I see is, to me, evolution is the expansion of human knowledge. And I think that religious thought is trying to connect those things in some way, which again gets back to oral tradition. Like, to me, it's like oral tradition is like evolution of cognition, but you can't, there's so many things you can't know. This is why I brought up Becca. Ever since we talk about this all the time. So, like, for example, like UNESCO is just now finally starting to accept the idea of intangible cultural heritage as being something that can and should be preserved. So, like, one of the things that Becca has studied a lot of is like, it's the differences between like Notre Dame, the building, like in architecture, the building is the object, right? And everybody in architecture in general is ignoring the use. So Becca's thesis when she was in London was arguing that the use of a space should be preserved. That it can change, that the changes of the use is part of its heritage. And so, like, Notre Dame is the object. The acoustics of Notre Dame is intangible heritage. But there are people that are trying to, like, oh, we can create software that can emulate the acoustics of Notre Dame, that you can sing into a microphone and it's going to sound like as if you're standing there singing, right? Like, there's people who, there's a really good, I think it's Radiolab or This American Life, one of the podcasts. There's a guy that's what he does. He goes around the world, and his whole thing is he's trying to record the sounds of animals that are going extinct. And he has audio that's like, this is the last known example of this bird before they disappeared. Like that's intangible cultural intangible heritage using a scientific tool. Now it's preserved. Like the sound of that bird is preserved, right? We can do that because of technology, but how many birds?
I'm a little confused on what you were saying as far as like an archaeological find doesn't necessarily prove said event or whatever. Because like you're saying the thing about recording the bird, right? 100 years from now, that bird's extinct.
There would be.
Does that recording not prove that that bird exists?
Yeah, I would say it does. Yeah, it does.
If
You know,
still play it because technology goes so crazy that you can't even play with the technology that it was for back then.
like
That's what I think about. With
if somebody tomorrow was like, we found the 10 Commandments, okay, saying the nature of the 10 Commandments, of what they are, okay, there's no, I cannot fathom a way of knowing, oh, those are the 10 Commandments. Does that make sense?
That those are the ones
Right.
from the story.
It's just there's no way you can know.
Okay, I see.
So, for example, we have these maps. These maps we've been using, and I've said in the class, like these maps are based on the academic consensus of where these places are. Okay. As an archaeologist, if you're like, hey, I want to go dig, right? It could cost money. You go to your school and you're like, hey, I want to go dig here, right? And they're gonna say, why there, right? The entire foundation of arguing where you dig and why you dig is based on oral traditions. It's like, well, you know, in Arabic they call this place this, and we can etymologically connect the sounds of these words to this, back to this, back to this, back to this. So maybe what these people who have lived here for generations call this mound in a field is the same name as what it used to be called 3,000 years ago when we read it in the text. Does that make sense? So it's the knowledge of the object, right? Like we know Jerusalem is Jerusalem because it's continued use for thousands of years by humans, and it's been passed down every generation. That is the most scientifically sound proof for knowing Jerusalem is Jerusalem. You're going to find things in Jerusalem that say Jerusalem. That's the second thing. Then is like if you can find an object that has the name of a place on it, that's your second like strongest scientific argument to be made. Like, hey, we should dig here. Does that make sense? Like, if you just dig in the ground and you find 2 stones of the 10 Commandments, there's no way of knowing. You can't possibly know. And even in the story itself, there's not anything in the story itself that's going to be like, oh, hey, now we know.
It looked like
Look at the cap thing that they go. This was the scarf that Jesus wear.
okay, yeah.
There's no way.
Yeah, the
But
shroud
with
of
our current
Turin. Yeah,
technology, with
yeah,
our
all of
current
that.
technology now, fast forward 100 years, you're saying that like, okay, yeah, that recording would prove that that's that bird because of the technology now, right? But if we're talking,
If you're a skeptic, right? It's like, well, maybe that was used, but that was fabricated by some AI, and that's you always have that, and that's why it's like, yeah, there's a limit. There's a limit to what we can know about a thing.
How do you? Whoa, you used to have family reunions?
Yeah.
It's on my father's side of the family, as a matter of fact. But you know what? Maybe y'all can help me. They're trying to erase my father's heritage. We gave land. My father's people gave land to an outreach church, the St. Peter and Paul Outreach Church, in a place called. It had a nickname, Pinchgut, Pennsylvania. Okay, very odd name. But anyhow, they gave this land. God help them. They gave this land to the Roman Catholic Church, okay? And I tell you, they want to try to erase my father's heritage because those tombstones are being taken away one by one. And I want that place to be preserved in Jesus' name.
Yeah,
Yes, they're trying to make it, bulldoze it over. And you know what they said to me? The Roman Catholic Church said to me, go to Washington, D.C. Go to Washington, D.C. And find that history of where your people gave it to the Roman Catholic Church. Prove it, yeah.
You guys, their last name Marzahn. Me and Becca, we went to Berlin. And outside of Berlin, there's this village called Marzahn, and that's where they're originally from. But the history that only goes back so far, because in the 40s, the Nazis went in and just destroyed any evidence of people that lived there prior. They just wanted to get rid of it. So like what would have been like the Marzahn graveyard in Marzahn, Germany is gone. And that's like graves. Great. And I brought it up in here. So I showed the pictures of my grandpa's tombstones. Graves are like unquestionably probably the most like where we get the most information, both archaeologically and in terms of oral traditions, is graves. And yeah, absolutely. Like,
You know what's Israeli goes into bulldoze graveyards in Gaza. That is so unarmed. Really? Wake up.
yeah,
And I
That's
got
a whole-
Jewish heritage. So what they're doing is harmful for the people that they're hurting. And they've been doing it for 75 years, but it's also harmful for the Jewish people.
and it's like I'm a like any cultural heritage should be known, sought to be preserved, like just all of it. I don't care who you are, just it needs to be. But that's like there's a huge gap, in academics, for example. It's like there's, you guys, you say, oh, you can't source a newspaper for like academic purposes, right? It's like, oh, okay,
Wait,
it, because it hasn't gone through. Basically, it's like, well, it hasn't had enough time to be proven to have been true, and so oral, yeah. So like, and so like, when it's like, I've thought a lot about this stuff with 9/11, and I've been trying to find it. I've been having a hard time finding it. There's a podcast I listened to a long time ago that they talk about this exact issue of oral traditions from 9/11 that we know scientifically are wrong, but those people's memories of these things are absolutely ingrained into their brains. And
About like where they were.
yes.
I saw a documentary
Yes.
about that. Like people have
And
exact recollection.
and it's
they were when they
the science, like the psychological rationalization is that it's like, okay, there's something to the way humans process memory, right, as some type of protective shield with trauma, right? And I'm like, I dare you to tell somebody that what they remember about something they experienced traumatically is wrong. Like, have fun with that. I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
I don't care how wrong they are. Like, it doesn't matter. And guess what? When it's all said and done, what of the two options are going to be preserved? What that person tells their grandkids
is what was passed on
Right.
forever.
It's got nothing to do with what we know factually, scientifically having been the case. It's like, that is not how people function.
I remember where I was or what I was doing when I got the news about 9/11.
Absolutely.
The documentary that I watched, it was like,
I know for myself, I mix up 9/11 and the collapse of the 35W bridge in my brain all the time. They were both on Tuesdays. We went to Hosanna both times. I'm like, this is like, it's like I'm literally like I mix those two things up. Like and like I know I could go back and probably scientifically figure out like, oh, actually what I remember about 9/11 was actually what happened when the 35W bridge collapsed. Like, whatever. I don't need to do that. It's like, like, but in some ways I'm like, I'm not going to pursue changing that, because it's one of the examples I point to that proves the point. It's like, this is how your brain works. This is how people function. And it's intimately connected to religious thought, you know? This is why, like, so much of it's like death. There's so much death in all of these things because, like, that's how we remember things, you know? And I think that's completely valid, totally valid. Yeah, absolutely.
That's a good way to put it, like telepathy.
And that's why I think there's some bounce.
Because we don't tell stuff enough.
There's communication and psychology at play of how you retain your own memories. So whether it's how you interpret an event happening, like to your point, factually what happened versus how you remember it.
Right.
And then memories also fade in strength over time. So what happened when you were 5, even traumatic, by the time you're 90, will be a different story.
Right.
Yep.
Not only your own retention of this memory, but the way you communicate it, how the other person's listening ability, how their retention of your memories. So in the oral tradition, to your point, things can change a lot in what's factual.
Add
No, like just
time
But
yes,
into the equation.
Of a story.
You know, I think about exactly that with like the Exodus.
well,
The story of the Exodus. It's like, did somebody named Moses exist? And it's like, let's just assume yes.
All it takes is like one grandparent with a terrible memory who's like, I think their name was like
Well,
Jebediah.
it's like, let's just
entire book is written down with Jebediah, and his name was actually something completely different, but Grandpa couldn't remember. Like,
yeah.
just saying.
No, I would. This is fascinating, just from an archaeological perspective regarding Moses, whether he was real or not, or whether they were there for 400 years, or and how large was the community that lived in Egypt? Because from an archaeological perspective, it's just like there's nothing to prove that.
So, and that's the exactly what I care about. Is I try to go, let's assume it didn't happen. Then what's the point? It's like, oh my gosh, you got thousands of years of tradition of meaning derived from the Exodus. And again, like, are you really going to tell a Jewish person, like, hey, you know, that thing that like your grandpa's, right? Like, it's like, come on. Like, it's bullshit, you know? Like, even if it didn't happen, it doesn't mean it doesn't have meaning, right? There's still purpose and intent and so much to learn there, right? The opposite path, let's assume it did happen. It's like, okay, well, you know, and I spent years studying, like, well, how do you fit the archaeological record and the timelines and all the things? And it's like, there's some interesting things, but it does change the narrative, you know? And that's the thing. And so one of the things, like, there's a guy on TikTok that I watch a lot. I love his content. His name is Dan McClellan. He's actually Mormon, which is fascinating. But he's a biblical scholar, and this is like all he talks about on TikTok. It's fascinating. And but he's a literary scholar. And one of the things that does drive me nuts, you know, is like, if it's like, oh, well, the text, like the story of the Exodus from a pure academic standpoint probably was not written down for the first time until like the 3rd century BCE. In other words, like, if it happened 1,000 years after it happened. And the thing what I don't find scholars in the field that I was trying to study talk about, because on the Christian side, you have very scientific, Western-minded thought processes that are very, and that's like, it's literally called apologetics. Apologists are people that are like trying to scientifically prove this happened, you know? And it's like, because there's no room for oral tradition, oral heritage. Like, America is losing the concept of intangible heritage via oral traditions. Like, we're losing it. You can see it in other countries very easily. You've traveled, you know what I'm talking about. And I'm like, I don't like apologetics. I studied that a lot, and I'm like, I don't like it. I think it's not necessary, right? So it's like you get these people on both, you know, like both sides of these coins are like fighting over these scientific matters, you know, but like what's not being discussed at all, right, is it's like, well, all because it wasn't written until the 3rd century. If that's what the scientific consensus is, that the first time this was written down was probably the 3rd century BC, that the whole thing is an allegory of the return from Babylon after the exile. Like, if it's like, okay, Sure. When was it orally conceived? And how do you know? You know, and to say, well, that doesn't exist, it's like, okay, like, well, I no longer value what you have to say because that's just factually not the case. Like, oral tradition exists, you know.
Histories that are passed down generation to generation, and our own person's memories, because there's a whole process of memorizing those stories so that
Yeah.
they're more accurate than just
Yeah.
memory.
I would agree.
Yeah.
Plus, they had
And-
nothing else to do. They
and
didn't have
that's
5,000 stories on TV on 3 different channels.
there's
Remake
there's
movies 6 times,
Yeah.
and you can't.
there's
remember
another
which
podcast
one.
I've been trying to find. Again, a lot of this stuff is like I've thought about it for years, and I remember like 10 years ago listening to something like, oh, if I ever teach about this, I'll have to show this, and now I can't find it. You know, it's like, but there was like a podcast that they go into like, yeah, like there's a tribe in Africa, for example, that it's like this is like a known thing to this day of like their memorization technique is like insanely sound, you know, of just the repetition. And here's the thing, it's so interesting that I love to think about is when memorization becomes music. Because then you get into stuff like jazz, you know, like you know why only like the children of slaves in the South of America could invent jazz music, you know. It's like because of these types of cognitive functions that's so different in thought than how like somebody that was trained in classical music thought about music, you know. And like jazz to me is like the definition of intangible oral tradition. Because the whole point of it is you're making it up as you go. You know how easy it is for some point in jazz music to just get lost to history forever. It's like, so interesting when you dig into that, and it's like, yeah, like, of course, like that's like the cultural heritage of slaves coming into New Orleans, you know, and and like they know rhythmically a lot of jazz is tied to field chants and stuff in Africa, because that's how you teach generations how to remember things, you know. And it's so interesting. I love all of this stuff, you know.
I
Um,
like to think activity when I think of jazz.
yeah, I think it's, and again, the point being is like we all do this. We all do this. You do it every day in ways that you don't even know, because that's like the point, you know. So, anyways, yeah. I love you all. Thanks for listening. I hope this was good stuff. So